So we're here to talk through this double LITS by Joseph Howard. Double LITS uses a lot of the connectivity rules as in a normal LITS, but also now brings in a constraint of region sizes as something to think about. You can see some of these regions like this one. It's going to be pretty tricky to get two shapes into this, particularly if the shapes come to these centralized cells. This region actually has 9 total cells, and so a 9-cell region is instantly split into 2 tetrominoes with a space in the middle. So we'll start in this upper left corner. And when we shade along a path, these adjacent cells can't both be shaded, and so on the top end, we can't actually put enough into this region. So these are all unusable. That comes all the way up to here. 2 places to look. This region now is pretty small. It's just got 10 open cells. And there's a case where with those 10 open cells, we've got to take some of these and we've got to put in another tetromino shape. So a cell like this cell, which is very close to all of the cells, can't be used. We're going to need to sort of cramp from the other end, dodge a central cell like this, which would make these groups come together, and end up putting in these 2 shapes. We've got an isolated set of shaded cells at the top, so these have to extend further right. If this cell isn't used, the shape becomes another L. 2 L's can't touch, so we know it for sure this cell is shaded. But this cell cannot be. It would put another L right here. And actually, to get 2 tetrominos in this region, this block has to take at least these cells. We still have disconnectivity, so we've got to take the next shaded section that we can. And note again, these cells are pretty cramped with all of the shading up above. If this cell was shaded, it would have to come straight down, form another eye. This, if this were shaded, would come through this block. And so still for connectivity reasons, we have to actually come into this region and take these cells and bend down. Otherwise, we'd form another eye next to an eye, and we don't know more than what we put into the grid to here, but this is at least a way to think about the shading. If this top cell were taken, it would form a T shape, and that would mark the cell as unused, the cell is unused, and the only path left to still shade would be these. And you'd form at least one more shape tetromino-wise, but there's nowhere else to connect to. And that a key constraint in this puzzle is that the whole tetromino map is staying connected. We're going to have to shade the L and not the T option to maintain connectivity. Right now, this shape up here still has just this one point of contact. Note that if it connected through this cell going further right, it would form another L. So we're back now to still having essentially one area of contact. The contact has to be here or here. In both cases, a cell like this is going to be shaded. If a cell all the way out to here were shaded, it would form another L, so that's not used. If this cell were shaded, it would take these 2, not this one, come down, that's another L. And so this actually is forced to be an I coming straight down, and that may be close enough to give some connection to what's below, but the I limits these cells around that I'm marking now. Come back a little bit to the space, and let's see that these cells being marked unused leaves 3 in between. Those also have to be unused. We have these 2 shaded cells, which right now have to cross this bounded line, so another tetromino is going to be in this space. Let's think about where that tetromino can go. It can't take this uppermost cell, so it's going to take at least these 3, which makes this unusable. This makes this an S tetromino for sure. With this being an L, shading this cell is impossible to form another L that touches. So these are the ones that are used, and we have another space where we're getting a group that's not well connected to other shapes in the region. And I'm just going to mark off now that 2 are in this region, all those cells are unused, and now that 2 are in this region, actually all of these cells are unused. So coming back to some of the things you were doing before, for connectivity, this now has one cell to connect out through. I'm going to take at least these. It's an I shape, so it's not going to take these, which would form another I. Mark those off. This region needs to have a second tetromino in it. We'll use at least these 3 cells for that. We've got to make a connected shape using one of these 2 cells. Notice that we're not going to be crossing this boundary edge when we do this. And if I took a case like taking this cell, it's going to be forced to come immediately down. You take one and not both of these. So this would come immediately down and then have to come over. This would come immediately down, have to come over. These two cells are for sure used. If I take this one, you'll see that I mark off, off, and on. I'm going to put another L next to an L next to an L. That's very bad. So this cell is used. But if I take this cell, I put another L next to an L next to an L, also very bad. And so a T next to this L is what's used. We have to figure out still how to keep these things connected, but we'll come to that in a second. The first thing we've really got to think about is a connectivity down in this part of the grid. And some of that is going to be keeping this L shape and this T shape. This T shape has to come out somewhere. And also getting another connection over to this shape, whether it's an I or an L. Whatever connection this has is going to come back through and eventually connect with this S, whether it's coming sort of through the top this way. Something like a T shape would be possible, an I would not be possible because it would put an I next to another I. There's a little bit of connectivity that comes through this shape, but let's actually look at this cell versus this cell for how this L gets out. This has really two options for it. It could come all the way out and be this L, or alternatively it could come over to here and take this fourth cell, but that's a T. And the T is canceled by the tetromino right here, and the L is canceled by the tetromino there. And so neither situation allows that cell to be shaded. So this connection has to come through this cell that I just marked. If it's shaded all the way from this side, we talked about how we're not going to make another L. If we made this I, that would put an I next to this, so this cell isn't used. For sure, this cell is used. We're going to take up at least one of the cells from this S shape, whether and again, it can't be all the way down to here and skip this cell. So at least one of these cells is used is how I would think about marking it. And it's going to connect back over to the left, but not be able to reach all the way through. So there's going to also need to be something in this side of this region to connect this S over to the left side. And so let's think a little bit about how this whole left comes together. I think that's going to be what's key. And one thing to notice is that if we don't use something in this space, and there will be a tetromino that fits in here, we know that something's got to be in this space, but we don't use this space at all, sort of coming like through this side with an I and then another L, or this I and then this L, you don't get too far over before you reach this space where you still have to cross these lines in some way. You've got to cross this hard edge, and that's because we really have a shape that's over here that doesn't have an easy way to connect into this or into this. And so these connections are the things we need to think hardest about and recognize alongside that actually this fact. If there's a connection to this point here, look back at this T-shape. This T-shape has to have some connection. One of these three cells is also used, and notice that whatever is here is not what's over here. And so actually, as far out of these cells, there can't be a third tetromino in the shape that connects through these. And so we actually could tell for sure that for connection reasons, there's not much we can do except come through the space here, that a single I isn't going to work. And so I see that as starting me from these cells, marking them off, where a second tetromino is already in the space. These cells can't be part of this shape. This has to connect to the shape immediately to the right, and so that forces this leftmost option to be the only tetromino that's allowed. And it actually forces all of this into the grid. That marks off a lot of other cells in white. These cells are as far away from this set as we can be. This still has to stay connected, so it's got to take these. And one of these is going to be part of a tetromino that's going to come back to the right. This is one in the region, and the only other place in this region it can connect is this one right to the other side. So just mark that in. Now we've got to consider that whatever cells we take here will have to link back into a tetromino that's in this S shape that it can't reach all the way over to here. And also these are as many as 4 away, so these cells, given that a tetromino is here and a tetromino is here, these cells won't be used by any shape. And 1, 2, 3, 4, these cells are too far away to be used by any shape. So we're going to need to connect something from this to these other parts of the grid, basically getting a link from here to here to here to have the whole thing work out. One thing to note about that, at the very least, is that this also connects into this shape, and that will have some certain forced deductions around it when we actually look at it carefully. So let's start with some counterfactuals. If this cell isn't used, then the only option is another eye down here, and this eye with an eye would have 2 similar shapes together. That wouldn't be any good. Everything in this shape looks to be an L, so let's note that the only shape that's coming through the S is an L shape, and that will also limit things we can do. For instance, if we shade it all the way up to this cell, the only way this forms is an L, so having 2 L's that need to avoid each other will give us the fact that this isn't used. And it looks like another useful cell is actually looking at this one. If this is an L shape, it forces this cell to be shaded to connect this group to this group, but then this group has 1, 2, 3 options left for it. This isn't usable because of the 2 by 2 rule, but all those options are also L's, and so this can't be an L connector because that would form various issues nearby. And actually, now that this isn't possible, the connector that comes through this, in all cases, actually this cell is used, and that means that this cell is taken, and that actually marks off all the actual other options for this space. And so the connection into this group has to come through this cell, and that means it's an S that's connecting the I on the left to this L, and this L doesn't want to touch another L, so this is an I here, and final shading of this being the last L. So a sort of slow grind through the end of this puzzle, but a lot of different steps that were hopefully helpful for you to see, starting very much from small compact regions, but even then in large regions, tracking where we have 2 groups to be used in these spaces, 2 groups in this space actually at the end, one coming through the T and one connecting from this right side in. All those routes of connectivity came together in this bottom center. And a really key takeaway was actually seeing when we had this worm-like shape that had just one type of tetromino possible in it, that itself limited a lot of stuff around it, particularly over here, where there are really just options for I's and L's. There might have looked to have been a T option, but the T option wouldn't have connected with the remaining shape. And so when I's and L's are around, the I is the one that ended up being the useful one. And maybe in your own solve you found this I before you found the rest. But altogether, a great challenge. Thanks, Joseph, for the puzzle, and we'll see you again soon.